The silence was the first warning. At 937 hours on July 25, 1944, in the Bocage country west of Saint-Lô, the relentless American artillery harassment that had pounded German positions for 6 weeks abruptly stopped. For the veterans of the Panzer Lehr Division, dug in along the Saint-Lô-Perriers road, this was not relief, it was a primal alarm. These were hardened men. They had endured the apocalyptic barrages of the Soviet artillery at places like Kursk, earth-shaking events that lasted for hours. They had weathered the methodical bombardments of the British at El Amin. They knew the rhythms of war, the predictable patterns of fire that allowed a seasoned soldier to find a grim comfort in the cadence of destruction. But this silence was different. It was a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. General der Panzertruppe Fritz Bayerlein, the tough and respected commander of Panzer Lehr, felt a deep unease as he peered through his field glasses. The morning mist still clung to the thick hedgerows, but the American lines were quiet. Too quiet, too quiet. It was the pause before a symphony of a scale and precision the world had never heard. At 938 hours, the vacuum was filled. Not with the sequential roar of a rolling barrage, not with the staggered thunder of batteries firing in turn, but with a single, unified, cataclysmic detonation that seemed to tear the sky itself. Over 1,000 American artillery pieces, from light 105mm howitzers to massive 240 monsters, had fired shells from distances ranging from 6 to 15 miles away. Through a miracle of coordination, every single one of those shells was calculated to arrive on its target at the precise same millisecond. For the German defenders, the world did not explode in sequence. It exploded in totality. One moment, there was an eerie silence. The next, the entire horizon in front of them erupted in a continuous, crashing wall of flame, dirt, steel, and pure concussive force. The ground didn't shake, it liquefied and leaped into the air. Strongpoints vanished. Trenches were erased. Men in deep dugouts were killed by the shockwave alone. This was not an artillery barrage. This was an artillery event. They called it a time on target. For the German soldier, it was the moment the science of war evolved into something unrecognizable. The moment industrial America applied its full organizational genius to the ancient art of killing. This is the story of how General Omar Bradley's artillerymen orchestrated that thunder, and how a single, perfectly timed minute shattered a German division, rewrote battlefield doctrine, and announced a new, terrifying age of automated, systemic warfare. To understand the shock of time on target, you must first understand the established grammar of artillery, a language written over centuries. For generations, artillery was a sequential art. Napoleon's grand battery massed guns to fire in devastating volleys, but they fired in sequence. In the trenches of World War I, the creeping barrage was perfected, a curtain of steel that walked ahead of the infantry at a predetermined steady pace. You could hear it coming. You could, if you were lucky, calculate its rhythm and maybe survive. The Germans themselves were masters of artillery concentration, their doctrine of Schwerpunkt focusing overwhelming force at a decisive point extended to their guns. They developed the Führerwalls, a rolling fire roller, and prided themselves on the flexibility and speed of their forward observers and battery commanders. A German Vorgeschobenenbauter forward observer could bring accurate, responsive fire down on a target in minutes. This system had crushed Poland, routed France, and mauled the Soviets in the early campaigns. When the Americans first landed in North Africa and later at Anzio, German professionals observed their artillery with a sense of superiority, even pity. It seemed slow, uncoordinated, tied to rigid pre-planned fires. At the Kasserine Pass in 1943, American artillery had failed disastrously. Batteries were isolated, communication broke down, and fires were never concentrated where they were needed most. German reports confidently noted the Americans' material wealth, but dismissed their tactical finesse. What they failed to perceive was not a lack of skill, but a period of metamorphosis. While the German army refined a system born of the 19th century, the Americans were inventing a system for the 20th. They were not just learning to shoot, they were learning to network. They were applying principles from the factory floor, standardization, interchangeable parts, process flow, and managerial coordination to the battlefield. The time on target was the product of this fusion. It represented a fundamental philosophical shift. Artillery was no longer a collection of individual guns supporting infantry. It was a single, dispersed, but centrally directed weapon system. A battery 20 miles away was just as much a part of the immediate fight as the rifleman in the hedge. This shift required not just new technology, but a new mind. It required a military that thought less like a band of warriors and more like the crew of a vast, distributed machine. The stage for this demonstration was the Normandy Bocage, a hellish landscape of sunken roads and immense hedgerows that had stalled the American advance for weeks. Bradley's plan for Operation Cobra was simple: blast a hole in the German front so wide and so deep that his armored divisions could finally break out into open country. The key to this was not just weight of shell, but the synchronization of shell. He needed to deliver a blow so instantaneous and so overwhelming that it would not just kill defenders, but shatter their entire defensive scheme before they could react. He needed to collapse time itself. For this, he turned to the quiet mathematicians with slide rules and canvas tents, the wire layers stringing communication nerves across a battlefield, and the factory workers in Pennsylvania and Ohio whose relentless pursuit of uniformity made the entire terrifying calculation possible. The magic of time on target was not a singular invention, but the flawless integration of four pillars. Remove any one, and the entire concept collapses into just another noisy, if impressive, bombardment. The first pillar was the forward observer system. The American foe was not merely a spotter for a single battalion, he was a portal to the entire Corps artillery arsenal. Perched in a church tower, hidden in a shell hole, or clinging to a tree in the bocage, he was the tip of a sensory spear. In his hands was the technological lifeline, first the SCR-609 radio, then the more reliable SDF-110. These weren't just walkie-talkies, they were nodes in a network. When an foe keyed his microphone and called a fire mission, his voice did not go to a single battery commander. It went to a fire direction center. This was the second pillar and the true brain of the operation. The FDC was a concept born in the interwar years at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and honed to a razor's edge in combat. Imagine a cramped, stuffy tent or a dugout, lit by bare bulbs, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Inside, a team of men, not grizzled combat veterans, but often young soldiers who had been accountants or engineers 6 months prior, worked with a quiet, focused frenzy. They were surrounded by firing tables, graphical plotting boards, maps, and slide rules. This was a mathematical clearinghouse. The foe call came in, grid coordinates, target description, desired effect. The FDC team sprang into a well-rehearsed ballet. One man plotted the target on a map. Another consulted the intricate firing tables for the specific type of gun and shell that would be used. Another calculated the precise azimuth. But for time on target, they performed a higher order of calculation: time of flight. 100 fovum schulfuden ang trajectory from mol o matak uden seconds to Urva. 150 fovum along tum forang from Osbehand this dot landsmatste fu fav seconds to have ordescelent at semansnes of euforsa hatawak bakusis from Achuk. The Oshad Falcamorns not as a funo, but as a far atham tum monas doro 1 seconds, tus lungtum battery and a far after monas sutun seconds, tus 100 fovum battery. Thus Ruckwad stackhungs, forung arms across dozens, somiums hundreds of guns. That stud pulamud thus staghung possibla. Communication wub, former recon ludwa with an almost pathologic obsession. Sungla infantry division on nomadics lovthrust on moles of telephone 1 month. Thus crutud redundant. Russelant novus sus. Rudy was provided backup, but this was the sakya static fru bakban. Over the Rigefri Juevdasa, Avir be observaturukbon post was connected on Fostesaksi but transmuted simultaneous to overpay battery unspread. Ovens almost within seconds. Futh Pula was this must mundane and yet this must revolutionary stanky zushan. Thus was this scuffed of Imurakan industry, ufirtap 100 furum hotzabardad. What you fought zon ethus, what of let osund had oduntuckle rough lung and chump the dummage. Uverpi man, 105 shui, what kufulod with explosive on Pennsylvania, Ulana had this exact sum, what, shup, and probable on chaja. Thus, mont as ballistak, performance was productive and consistent. A show from Lathash Subio Fudesawan, which behöver exactly like a show from Lathash på 5,500 utanen. Thus productability was they, fund up on watch all this purposes yama flexes wobble. German industry, kropled babumbung, and uncrusanglo rulowant on the peaceposud, slavlupshire, factories, xies that much thus consistent. German autola offasgefon had the tusfa runs from no aminoshan bachtaso, do actually kuma or laxgare impossible on the sodi samorek, this samorak and system osomot fuckban from factory and bolt at kolong sansa upon that. Thus fupolis, futs ufdessa, wub, and this stankers schol bish from geographic spas. On its delta spas, grad of Kardenak and Tomungs with dafted borskarlid was prasusion of rurid tum. Stugat arofa upperpon kubra was a rukteng devuth ruffla 7,000 yuds, what in 2,500 yeds dup, straightling the sunt laporas. Instead, thus bucks was this of this. Olutupansk look dovajan, ego blus. Funnest amuret famutbanans zamanota of bat, and elements of this fifth parushu dovajan. Thus one not static garrison traps. The Wamable, who do not veterans dag anichtas, noman hadras wadha labkant of camouflage posapuns in tukung folds of fa, and dubcommon bunkers. General Bradley had assembled fossa of Otuloa of Stapafung skull. Oburzi 1,000 guns from this Raman 7 and Romanuti Kaulan, Runjung from this Yoboquadas 150 favam along Tums, Atanchotsas, and this Kolostas and this Kolosta 100 Fodum o Black Dragon Havi Udula. Adato thus were 4.2 on Havi Modas and Oven Tanktastrus used on Antrak for roll. As Titz's Dukpo was a Logistics and Koramastas Natma, 170,000 runs allocatude for its upwinning fuzz. A stack on testament to this solid supplichun that stretched unbroken back to butchutes and across Atlantic. Plan was dosapovlo simplo and kunzapt fundashlo complex and executpan. First, wavdu wav of heavy bombers which drop explosives and German rutters a tactic that proved tragedy flood when some bombs fall shut on its American. But then on this, standard aftermath of this, all bombardments grund with at each hour. Every artillery piece would fire a first round in a carefully orchestrated time on target. Then, they would shift to a blistering, sustained rate of fire, only to snap back into perfectly synchronized hot missions at planned intervals, walking the concentrated fire through the depth of the German positions. The idea was to give the defenders no rhythm, no pattern, no moment to breathe or reorganize. The initial silence before the storm was a psychological weapon in itself. For the Germans in their holes and trenches, the minutes after the bombers passed were filled with the desperate sounds of survivors digging out, officers shouting for reports, the moans of the wounded. They were vulnerable, disoriented. And then, at 938, the American artillery system executed its first definitive command. From batteries hidden in orchards, from gun pits in fields, from positions so far back the gunners never saw the front, shells arced into the sky. Their flight times had been calculated to the fraction of a second. The 105s fired last, their high-angle shots climbing steeply. The heavy 8-inchers and 240s had fired tens of seconds earlier, their massive projectiles describing long, slow parabolas. As the German soldiers braced for the incoming roar, they heard instead a single, apocalyptic crack thunder that consumed the entire world. It wasn't an explosion you heard with your ears. It was a physical blow you felt in your bones, your teeth, your soul. One veteran of the Eastern Front described it as der Himmel fell als ein Stück. The sky fell as one piece. The effect was geometrically more devastating than a rolling barrage. In a rolling barrage, the concussion and overpressure move across the ground. In a TOT, the overpressure from hundreds of shells detonating simultaneously creates a single overwhelming shock wave that impacts the entire target zone at once. Foxholes and trenches, designed to protect from sequential explosions, offered no protection. The blast wave traveled down trench lines, killing men around corners. It collapsed deep dugouts, burying men alive. It tossed armored vehicles like toys. The carefully prepared defensive positions of Panzer Lehr were not simply hit, they were unmade. In that first minute, the division ceased to function as a coherent military formation. Communications were vaporized. Command posts disappeared. The carefully planned fallback positions and counterattack routes were transformed into a smoldering, cratered lunarscape. General Bayerlein's famous report, sent later that day, captured the totality of the shock. My front lines look like the face of the moon, and at least 70% of my troops are out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. All my forward tanks have been knocked out. The roads are practically impassable. The word akrasti was the tell. This was beyond physical destruction. It was a systemic attack on the human mind's ability to process violence. The Germans had just encountered industrial warfare reduced to its purest, most efficient form, the application of maximum force at a mathematically precise point in time. The shock of Cobra's opening tot was not an isolated event, but the opening note in a symphony of fire that would play across Western Europe for the next 11 months. As the American breakout gained momentum, German commanders scrambled to understand and counter this new artillery phenomenon. So, their initial intelligence assessments were dismissive, chalking up the reports of perfectly synchronized barrages to shell-shocked soldiers or lucky coincidence. But the evidence became impossible to ignore. The Battle of Mortain in early August, Hitler launched a desperate counteroffensive, Operation Luttich, aiming to cut off the advancing American spearheads. Elements of 4 SS Panzer divisions slammed into the overextended American line. The U.S. 30th Infantry Division, holding the key ground of Hill 317, was surrounded and cut off, but they held an asset more powerful than tanks: unobstructed observation. From the heights of Hill 317, American forward observers could see the entire German buildup. As German panzers and infantry massed in the villages and valleys below for their assault, the observers called down tot fire on pre-registered coordinates. The German attack, launched at midnight, was met not with small arms fire, but with orchestrated thunder. Entire companies were caught in the open as they formed up. Supply columns were annihilated on narrow country roads. The 30th Division's artillery, and the core assets it could call upon, fired over 20 separate time-on-target missions that night alone. The effect was not just destructive, it was paralyzing. The German attack lost all cohesion before it could even properly begin. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge reported to Hitler that continuation was impossible against the enemy's incredible artillery superiority and his total command of the air. The tot had proven itself in defense as decisively as in offense. Then came the Hürtgen Forest in the fall, a nightmarish battle in dense, wet woodland the Germans considered artillery-proof. American gunners adapted the tot principle to create the free burst barrages. By calculating fuses to detonate shells in the upper canopy, they turned the forest itself into a weapon. The airbursts showered the ground below with a deadly rain of white-hot shrapnel, splinters the size of spears, and burning phosphorus. A survivor described it as a der Wald word sofort zur Hölle. The forest became instant hell. The psychological torment was magnified by the acoustics of the woods. The dense trees muffled the sound of incoming fire until it was too late. There was no warning whistle, just the sudden, all-encompassing detonation. In the frozen hell of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, time on target reached a new level of lethality with the introduction of the VT, variable time, fuse, the proximity fuse. For the first time, an artillery shell could sense its own height above the ground and detonate at the perfect altitude for maximum fragmentation spread. When VT-fused shells were incorporated into a tot mission, the result was apocalyptic. No foxhole, no slit trench was safe. The air above the target area became a blender of steel. German troops who had learned to dive for cover at the sound of incoming rounds found that cover useless. They believed the Americans had deployed a new, diabolical weapon, perhaps radio-controlled mines or cluster munitions. The truth, that it was simply the marriage of precise timing with a smarter fuse, was almost more frightening in its implication. American technical innovation was accelerating faster than German intelligence could track it. The true genius of the American system lay not in the complexity of its idea, but in the democratization of its execution. While the German military tradition prized the intuition and experience of the veteran Unteroffizier and Hauptmann, the American system aimed to make lethal expertise a reproducible industrial product. This was most perfectly embodied in the training pipeline at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. be a school of fire. Here, the U.S. Army performed a miracle of social and military engineering. It took civilians, farm boys, college students, mechanics, clerks, and in a brutally condensed 17-week course, transformed them into the technicians of the new artillery age. The curriculum was a relentless immersion in the science of destruction, ballistics, meteorology, survey, and communications. But the heart of the training was the Fire Direction Center drill. Students performed thousands of simulated fire missions, crunching numbers on slide rules and graphical plotting boards until the process became muscle memory, until they could think in grid coordinates and time-of-flight curves. Goal was not to kruta artillerist on this old yarnapun mold, but to kruta human components on a fu control system. A competent yuftasa, tam, fresh from futsal, kitchulitsa, complex tunbatory in, intithromanas, undithromanats. Thus, a mass productipon of expertus German intelligence won the bogan topus of Togot from Prosinkion Torogad Inzen Kapchkudagimans. Germany's other law officers were products of a lin Soluktov apprenticehood. Omarukas were products of an ensemble lan, stunk dozed, offushant, and raplusubbed, thus mirrored this dupawa of productpan. This Gimarukan Odulaman Slud Rula was this Kanpatus Rusis. This systematic flow of data on an uftasam morarudi, systematic flow of putson. A bumkiosumblalan. This did not just at Protesangs Rukan shuls and guns. It was at Protesang than Tronen Mannis kapab of Wuldung das tolls with synchronized precision. Thus systemak advantage become a vicious sukla for the virtude the utritude an American fotsjobzava an yuftasatam. On it you dantakali troned tam raplisidham. Dalaja was unstatational, not in the German Molatua, but contrast was blood on UT, Junuyupin of Pripolas subt, Uxperb untuali, Ajukuted, Uvers, and Bu, Dud, you non ton forafa, grun American of dasatam, following its futsal plubjik, Kstolova, mathematically perfect bombardment than Fodoran German battery komanki with use on the system. Thus rulumans and system UV video heroism extended to the Turamust anglam Chris, yet mas critical, ulamant of Ulga, for shul to travel up to 15 moles and erova within a fraction of a second of its kunivats calculated air. Yanota to not more than just this tostansa. Yanota to not this one not just at ground level, but at upper piece stratum of a shuluch pastra. Yanota da tamper pedshi dansuru, and Hyamodaras that shuls flut. So Americans the plow was a breathtakungskap and extrusi. Evropka had a todokarad wado saktapan. Tom's lunch at radio sunda bulons that telematurad atmospheric duda from up to 30,000 foot. Grunstapan stay rodongs overpi. Duda manats. Thus constant strum of dudo was fed back to this uftasa. Worth was uncupper turud anichbis ferang haukijushan. One de chunja at ton doesn't foodet accuse man shol oravang. Critical hafsakun loot. Tonang pofukla sun chronist. Tatanis slutla stakuprush. Omurakan system olamanata that for. Anas, Herchin foresta doing this. Asa goals of this adunas. Well jamin adulo fubukam uncrasangla oratak dodfun content. For with the offux American tat mushans montunud the murderous pursuit. Vitsigumun Sulch was the subjected to a no kunda fut. Doth uterad not just from a mapku donut, but from a weatherchat. Has environment. This very hub brothered had been quantified and wuponastogen. Thus fusion of duda strums, observer reports ballistic tubs, rule with the duda, communication sonanes, aneto sangla forang solution was perhaps this purest expression of this. No woofa, Spudfeld was no longer just a kuniest of Tehran and war, it was a data processing challenge. Boost said what to fusto ma katrid and ma integrated duto lip one. Human response to thus systemic onslaught was a study on Daspirut and ultima futul adaptation. Kapt kutagimon's revel vamak struggling to diagnose a problem. A report from the Jumin Omas weapons testing office considered American code united for Ignaki represents Igno Jukjits separata and computational degrusas and communication integritapan, the effect of conjuntas with consuming capabilities. The Andekosara of Amantaga. The unmathematicians chewed the earth, but they lacked every foundational pillar to execute it at scale. Their communications network was primitive and vulnerable by comparison. Their ammunition was inconsistent. They could not mass-produce trained FDC personnel. successful. Their attempts to mimic Tott, such as during the Nordwind Offensive in January 1945, involved at most 8 batteries and resulted in impacts scattered over 10-12 seconds, a technical failure that, in the domain of synchronized fire, was the difference between a symphony and noise. The psychological toll of facing this inescapable, precision-engineered violence became a medical category unto itself. German field surgeons and psychiatrists began noting a specific syndrome among survivors of multiple Tott barrages, distinct from classic shell shock, ZES. Men exhibited a profound terror of synchronicity itself, a paralyzing anxiety triggered by any coordinated sound like a door slamming in unison or a group of people clapping. They suffered from an inability to process multiple stimuli, their cognitive functions shattered by an event that delivered overwhelming sensory input in a single, uncompressed packet. The brain's normal coping mechanism to sequence and rationalize traumatic events had nothing to work with. The trauma arrived whole, complete, and instantaneous. These men weren't just wounded, their mental model of warfare and of predictable cause and effect had been deleted. The climax of the time-on-target revolution occurred not in the breakout or the desperate defenses of winter, but in the methodical, world-ending grind of the advance into Germany itself in the spring of 1945. As Allied armies reached the Rhine, the last great natural barrier, they faced fortifications of the Siegfried Line, thick concrete bunkers, steel-domed pillboxes, and interlocking dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles. German commanders, retreating into this prepared fortress, believed they had finally found sanctuary from the coordinated thunder. They were wrong. The American artillery system simply adapted its calculus to a new problem set. For fortifications, FDC devised mixed Tott missions. They would program some batteries with delayed fuse, concrete-piercing shells to slam into bunkers a split second after other batteries, high-explosive shells, detonated on the surface. The effect was to hammer the fortification with a simultaneous shockwave from the outside and a penetrating blow from a following round, often causing catastrophic internal spalling, the concrete itself fracturing into deadly fragments inside the bunker. At the Rhine crossings, the scale of synchronization became almost unimaginable. For Operation Varsity, the massive airborne and amphibious assault across the Rhine in March 1945, Allied planners concentrated over 4,000 artillery pieces. The preparatory bombardment was a rolling sequence of precisely timed Tott missions, involving hundreds of guns firing across multiple divisions and corps. The mathematical and communication challenge of orchestrating fire from British, American, and Canadian batteries, each with different gun characteristics and procedural nuances, and making their shells land in coordinated waves, represented the zenith of the artilleryman's art. The concussion was so vast that soldiers reported feeling the air pressure change in their lungs miles from the front. German defenders on the far bank described the experience beyond comprehension. The world did not merely explode. It vibrated into a solid mass of noise and fury, the ground ceasing to be solid, the air unbreathable, with men found dead in perfectly intact bunkers, their bodies unmarked, killed by the sheer force of the atmospheric compression. At Oppenheim, where Patton's Third Army made a surprise crossing, the supporting Tott barrage, though smaller in scale, was a model of ruthless efficiency. 33 artillery battalions, over 400 guns, fired a 1-minute Tott mission that delivered 10,000 shells onto a concentrated area. A German battalion holding the sector simply ceased to exist. No survivors emerged to report, no wounded crawled back. The position was just silent. Overrun by American infantry minutes later, it was found to be a landscape of craters overlapping craters, with no recognizable military equipment or human remains larger than a fragment. It had been processed out of existence. The ultimate testament to the psychological domination achieved by time on target, however, came not in these massive set-piece battles, but in the crumbling, sporadic resistance of the Reich's final weeks. A new and potent phrase entered the lexicon of German commanders negotiating surrender. Bitte keine Zeit auf Ziel, please, no time on target. The mere threat of calling down a coordinated barrage became a weapon more potent than the barrage itself. Towns and cities, ordered by fanatical Nazi officials to fight to the last man, would often surrender en masse after a single demonstration Tott mission on a nearby forest or hill, a terrifying sample of the obliteration that awaited them. The German soldier, once famed for his stubborn defense, had been systematically conditioned. He had learned that against this system, courage was not merely futile, it was irrelevant. Personal bravery could not stop a shell whose trajectory was calculated by a man with a slide rule a dozen miles away. Unit cohesion could not survive a strike that annihilated the entire unit in the space between heartbeats. The final lesson was a cold one. In this new age, the highest military virtue was not mud, courage, but synchronicität. The war ended with the German military, the institution that had launched the Blitzkrieg, in awe of an enemy whose greatest innovation was a perfectly synchronized clock. The legacy of this revolution raced around the world even before the guns fell silent. Soviet observers, masters of the devastating but crude hurricane barrage, studied American-taught techniques with intense, pragmatic interest. The British, though allies, were equally impressed. Field manuals were rewritten. In the post-war world, the defeated Germans became the most fervent students of their own lesson. When the Bundeswehr was established in 1955, the first requirement for its new artillery arm was a built-in, NATO-compatible capability for coordinated, synchronized fire, a direct institutional scar from the trauma of 1944. The Israeli Defense Forces, founded in 1948, embedded taught principles into their doctrine from the very beginning, advised by Jewish American artillery veterans who had helped perfect the system. NATO's entire Cold War strategy of flexible response against the numerically superior Warsaw Pact relied on the concept that Western technological and coordination superiority, epitomized by the evolved descendants of Tott, could counter and disrupt a Soviet armored thrust. The modern battlefield, where a drone controller in Nevada can orchestrate the simultaneous strike of assets from multiple services and countries against a single target, is the direct philosophical descendant of that July morning in Normandy. The thread runs straight from the graphical firing table at Fort Sill to the digital fire control computer in an N109 Paladin to the networked kill web of today's joint warfare. The Americans had not just invented a new tactic, they had pioneered a new paradigm, the battlefield as a network and victory as a function of data latency and synchronization. To stand in the shoes of a German soldier enduring a time on target is to experience the unraveling of reality itself. Imagine the sequence not from the omniscient view of history, but from the mud, fear, and limited horizon of a Lancer in a slit trench. First, the unnatural silence, more terrifying than any noise. Your ears, tuned for weeks to the distant thump and whistle of harassing fire, ring with absence. You glance at the veteran next to you, the one who survived Stalingrad. His face is not calm, it is pale, frozen in a mask of dread. He knows this silence is wrong. Then, without the rising shriek of incoming rounds that allows a man to press himself into the earth, the universe fractures. There is no first explosion to herald the rest. The world simply and everywhere at once becomes explosion. The sound is not a roar, it is a single immense tearing crack that swallows all other sound forever. The concussion hits you like a physical wall, driving the air from your lungs. The ground beneath you does not shake, it leaps. It bucks and heaves as if a giant fist is punching it from below. Your trench, your carefully dug sanctuary, becomes a trap. The earthen walls dissolve into a cascading rain of dirt. The shockwave travels through the soil, a seismic event that feels like the planet itself is breaking apart. You are not being shelled, you are inside the shell. The air turns hot and thick, acrid with the smell of high explosive burning earth and something else. Ozone, as if lightning has struck all around you. Dirt and debris fall not from the sky, but from every direction at once. Then, as your mind reels from the first unified impact, before it can even begin to process or seek cover, the second Tott mission lands. It is not a continuation. It is a repetition of the initial apocalypse. The same all-encompassing, instantaneous detonation. There is no rhythm to find, no lull to exploit, no direction from which the fire comes. It comes from everywhere and nowhere. It is omnipresent. This is the core of the psychological break. The human brain is a pattern-seeking engine. It survives trauma by sequencing it, the whistle, the bang, the pause, the next whistle. Time on target denies this sequencing. It delivers the entire traumatic event. the maximum possible sensory overload in a single, uncompressed packet. The brain's defense mechanism short-circuits. This is why veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had endured Soviet barrages that lasted for days, broke under taut barrages that lasted minutes. The Soviet barrage was a storm you could weather. The taut was the instantaneous vacuum of a torpedoed ship, a complete catastrophic failure of your environment all at once. The after-action reports from German medical officers are clinical records of this cognitive annihilation. They describe soldiers found wandering, mute, and catatonic. Men who would scream and dive for cover at the synchronized slamming of car doors, a profound debilitating terror of any coordinated sound, a choir, a drumline, machinery operating in unison. The syndrome had a unique quality. It was resistant to rest. A soldier with classic shell shock might recover with time away from the front. A soldier broken by taut often carried the splintered perception permanently. His mind had learned a terrible new truth, that chaos could be perfected, and that perfected chaos was the most terrifying thing of all. From the American side of the hill, the experience was one of godlike impersonal power. For the young gunner pulling the lanyard on his 155N howitzer, his world was one of routine and data. He received a fire command not to hit the enemy in the woods, but to fire at a specific azimuth with a specific charge at a specific second on the clock. He never saw the target. He never heard the screams. His war was one of trigonometry and timetables. His contribution to the collective detonation was a single note in a chord played across a 20-mile-wide instrument. In the Fire Direction Center, the war was even more abstract. It was a world of numbers, vectors, and clean lines on a map. The frantic call from the forward observer, target enemy battalion in assembly area, grid whiskey foxtrot 293,845, request time on target over, was translated into a series of cold, precise calculations. The humanity of the target, the lives about to be unmade, were irrelevant data points. The FDC purpose was to solve a complex ballistic puzzle and to solve it faster and more accurately than the enemy could solve theirs. This abstraction was the true hallmark of the new warfare. The American system created a psychological distance, a buffer of technology and procedure between the act of killing and the killer. The moral burden was diffused across the network. The observer who called it in, the FDC team who crunched the numbers, the wireman who laid the line, the factory worker who filled the shell, the gunner who pulled the cord. No single person felt responsible for the hell they collectively authored. This was warfare as a corporate enterprise, with division of labor and operational efficiency reports. The product was synchronized destruction, and the U.S. Army had become its most proficient manufacturer. This systemic detachment had a brutal corollary. It was endlessly scalable and relentlessly consistent. The emotional exhaustion, the battle fatigue that crippled individual initiative in older styles of combat had far less hold on a soldier who was essentially a technician following a procedure. He could fire 100 devastating taut missions with the same mental expenditure as a clerk processing 100 forms. The system cared only that the form was filled out correctly. This is what German professionals like General Hans Eberbach meant in their reports when they spoke of industrial warfare. They weren't just referring to the volume of shells. They were describing the factory-like process of killing, the input of target data, the throughput of calculation and communication, the output of synchronized fire, with quality control ensured by standardized parts and trained personnel. They realized with sinking horror that they were not fighting an army of warriors, but the operational arm of a society that had mastered the art of the process, a society that could turn the making of breakfast cereal and the making of war into two branches of the same logistical tree. The story of time on target is incomplete without acknowledging the silent, forgotten architects, the industrialists, the engineers, and the workers of the American home front. The precision required for taut did not begin in a foxhole in Normandy. It began on the drafting tables of the WWII arsenal and in the quality, control labs of the DuPont powder factories. It was a precision born of the American faith in interchangeability, a principle that dated back to Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, now applied to the machinery of death. Every single component of the system had to conform to a near-fanatical standard. The brass cartridge case for a 105mm shell had to be perfectly machined so that its dimensions were identical to 10 million others, ensuring a perfect seal in the breech and consistent propellant burn. The threads on every fuse had to be cut to a tolerance measured in thousandths of an inch, so they would screw seamlessly onto any shell body from any plant. The powder grains in the propellant bags had to be of identical size and composition, lot after lot, to produce the same muzzle velocity every time. This unglamorous, relentless pursuit of uniformity was what made the high mathematics of the FDC possible. The artillerymen's calculations were predictions, and predictions are only as good as the consistency of the things they predict. The American gunner could assume that shell hash 7,890,321 would behave exactly like shell hash 1. The German gunner could assume no such thing. As the Reich's industrial base fragmented under bombing and its labor force was replaced by starving, sabotaging slave workers, the quality of its munitions deteriorated catastrophically. Powder batches were inconsistent. Shell casings had flaws. Fuses failed. A German battery commander had to constantly adjust his fire because each new batch of ammunition performed differently. His war was one of constant recalibration and uncertainty. The American battery commander operated in a world of engineered certainty. His firing tables were gospel because the products they described were scripture. This industrial bedrock supported another staggering advantage: volume. The statistics defy comprehension. In the month of March 1945 alone, as the final Rhine crossings were prepared, American artillery in Europe fired over 65,000 tons of ammunition. The supply chain that delivered this torrent was a logistical masterpiece that had no parallel in human history. It was a river of steel that flowed from factories in the Midwest, down railways to East Coast ports, onto specially designed Liberty ships, across the U-boat-infested Atlantic, onto the miraculous artificial harbors at Omaha and Utah beaches, onto fleets of trucks, the famed Red Ball Express, and finally to the ammunition points just behind the front lines. This river never stopped. A battery could fire off its basic load of ammunition in a furious 30-minute taut sequence, and within hours, fresh trucks would arrive to replenish it, often under fire. The German soldier, by contrast, lived in a world of scarcity and rationing. An entire German division might be allocated the shell allotment that a single American battalion would expend in a morning's preparation. This disparity created a chilling asymmetry. The American artillery could afford to be profligate. They could fire taut missions not just on confirmed troop concentrations, but on suspected assembly areas, on road junctions, on patches of forest that might conceal the enemy. They could use fire to shape the battlefield, to deny terrain, to harass, to interdict, all with the confidence that more shells were always coming. For the German, every shell was precious, to be used only on a verified, high-value target. This meant the American infantrymen advanced knowing that any call for fire would be answered with overwhelming, instant force. The German infantryman retreated knowing that his call for fire might go unanswered, or might bring a pitiful, scattered response. The artillery imbalance didn't just destroy men and machines, it destroyed the very premise of tactical parity. The legacy of the artillery revolution of 1944-45 is not merely a chapter in military history. The core principle of time on target, the networked integration of dispersed sensors, centralized command, and precision-guided effects, is the DNA of every advanced military on Earth today. When a U.S. Air Force E-3 AWACS aircraft guides a flight of F-35 fighters to launch missiles at a target whose coordinates were provided by a Navy SEAL team's laser designator, and those missiles are timed to impact simultaneously with a cyber attack that disables the enemy's air defenses. That is the philosophical and technical descendant of the TOT mission. It is the same paradigm. Disparate assets, geographically separated, synchronized in time and purpose to achieve a single, devastating operational effect. The kill chain is just the digital, globalized child of the fire direction net. The modern buzzword, multi-domain operations, is simply the recognition that what the Americans did with 105 MBs and 155 M guns, we now do across land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. The goal remains identical: to collapse the enemy's ability to make decisions and react by delivering coordinated, overwhelming effects faster than his organizational loop can process them. The German Wehrmacht was the first military to be defeated not by a superior fighting culture, but by a superior information culture. They were outdated. They were outsynced. The battlefield confusion, Nebel, they once sought to create with Blitzkrieg was turned against them as a weapon of absolute clarity. Their command posts were isolated and destroyed not by chance, but by a system that could identify, prioritize, and strike them with the efficiency of a corporate merger. On this muslustung ompactive that julumorang monat bon molotiu doctorac, but ans hjomon soko, Omon tugat onansadis aravd of a form of volonza that was abstract, impersoned, and inescapable. It was violence divorced from the heat of battle, the clash of bayonets, the visible enemy. It was violence as a natural disaster with a return address. Utmodavrpi, frontlandsolski, namakyo brav I skalod, fundamentally vulnerable to dusojon, mudba a fusla spasualust, a continent owa, Upperutong on Dodoho, which nuffs. It was the first chilling hint of a future where war would be waged not by armies, but by systems against systems, where the human being in the loop is both the operator and the ultimate target, reduced to a pattern of energy on a sensor screen, a pattern to be deleted by a synchronized click. The thunder that fell on Panzer Lehr was the sound of that future arriving. Let us return one final time to that rectangle of Normandy earth south of the Saint-Lô-Perriers road in the minutes after the synchronized thunder faded. The smoke, thick and greasy, began to slowly drift on a breeze that could not have been felt during the cataclysm. The craters were not discrete holes. They overlapped, merged into one another, creating a tortured topography of earthen waves and void. What had been a meticulously prepared defensive zone, a textbook example of German tactical defense in depth, now resembled, as Bayerlein said, a lunar landscape. But the moon is silent. This was not. The silence was now broken by the cries of the wounded, not the organized shouts of NCO, but the raw, animal sounds of men whose world had just been physically and mentally obliterated. Tanks, the proud Panthers and Mk Rofor of Panzer Lehr, lay upended or burning, their armor cracked open not by precise anti-tank shots, but by the sheer concussive force of earth moving beneath them. Telephone wires, the lifelines of command, were not just cut. They were vaporized, along with the men who had been in the bunkers that anchored them. The survivors who emerged from this wasteland did so not as soldiers, but as shock victims. They moved slowly, dazed, their uniforms coated in fine gray dust, their eyes wide and uncomprehending. They had no unit cohesion, no orders, no direction. The carefully planned counterattack routes were now geological features. The fallback positions were masked. The division, as a structured entity capable of coordinated resistance, had been deleted in a span of time shorter than it takes to boil an egg. And then, through the smoke came the new sound. The methodical, grinding advance of American tanks and the steady, dispersed crackle of Moan-Garons. The infantry of the 4th and 30th Divisions moved forward not against a defended line, but into a conquered space. Their job was not to assault, but to occupy and mop up. The artillery had done the assault for them. This was the ultimate realization of the new doctrine. Artillery was no longer a supporting arm. It was the primary maneuver element. The infantry were the possessors, the consolidators. The real battle had been a contest of mathematics and logistics fought minutes earlier and miles away. The German soldiers' bitter, enduring question, "Where was our artillery?" had a simple, terrible answer. It was there, it was trying, but it was speaking a different language, a language of individual notes in a world that now only understood chords. It was fighting a duel with pistols against the opponent who had just invented the machine gun. The duel was over before it began. The story of time on target is ultimately a story about time itself. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance, were fighting in sequential time. Their actions followed one another. Observe, decide, order, fire, adjust. The Americans, through a combination of technology, training, and industrial might, learned to fight in synchronous time. They collapsed the sequence. Observation, decision, order, and the firing of 100 disparate guns were all aligned to a single shared point on the clock. H-hour. This is why its impact was so disorienting. It violated the fundamental human and military experience of cause and effect. In a world of sequence, you can hide in the pauses. In a world of synchrony, there are no pauses. There is only before and after, with the event itself a dimensionless point of transformation. For the men of Panzer Lehr 937 belonged to one world, a world of mud, trenches, and familiar threat. 938 belonged to another, a world of ash, crater, and incomprehension. The bridge between them was not a duration, it was an instantaneous phase change, like water flashing to steam. This conquest of time is its most profound legacy. Every modern precision strike, every networked battlefield, every effects-based operation is an attempt to repeat that magic trick, to make force appear at a precise coordinate at a precise moment, as if conjured from the void, minimizing the warning, collapsing the enemy's decision cycle into irrelevance. We live in a world shaped by that July morning, the digital age with its emphasis on networks, real-time data, and synchronized systems is the peaceful echo of the artillery revolution. Our civilian world of global logistics, instant communication, and just-in-time delivery is the benign twin of the system built to deliver just-in-time destruction. The same organizational genius that terrified Berlin now brings a package to your door in a day. The line between the two is hauntingly thin. The final, unanswerable question hangs in the air, as potent as the smell of cordite after a barrage. The American system of 1944 was a tool to defeat a monstrous evil, and it did so with undeniable, world-altering efficiency. But in doing so, it unlocked a paradigm of power that is morally neutral. It perfected a method of applying violence that is clean for the user, abstract, and terrifyingly scalable. The men in the FDC were not killers by intent. They were problem solvers. The gunner was not a warrior. He was a technician following a procedure. This is the enduring paradox and the perennial danger when the act of killing becomes a system, when courage is replaced by calculation and chaos is perfected into a deliverable product. What does it mean for the soul of a nation and for the future of war? The coordinated thunder that announced the arrival of this new age has long since faded from the Norman fields. But the silence that followed it is not the silence of peace. It is the listening silence of history, waiting to hear what we, the heirs of that system, will choose to build and what we will choose to destroy with the awesome, synchronized power we now command.